Hey everyone, welcome to the Uniting America podcast, presented to you by Braver Angels. I'm Braver Angels National Ambassador and your host, John Wood Jr. This is your doorway into the movement to save the Republic, the movement to realize the dream of Martin Luther King. Join us. This is the movement to build a house united. In this episode, I speak with popular YouTuber, media entrepreneur, and political commentator Kim Iversen, also former co-host of The Hill Rising. Now, Kim is no longer a co-host of The Hill Rising, owing to a controversy involving an interview that aired on the program featuring Dr. Anthony Fauci. Kim was the network's leading critic of our COVID response, and yet she was suspiciously absent from that episode, leading her to resign in protest. You'll hear a bit more about that shortly. Kim Iversen is a close friend of mine, I should say. She's a populist progressive who outrages many progressives, sort of how I'm looked at by some on the right as a squishy establishment Republican who some conservatives don't care for. Oh well, I can't please everyone. But Kim and I both agree on the need for representatives of our political and public health establishment to engage their critics and not hide from the American people. At Braver Angels, we have sought to bring such leaders to the American people directly. You'll get a taste of that in this episode as we cut away from our talk with Kim for a moment to bring you an excerpt of a Braver Angels debate event with Dr. Francis Collins, President Biden's chief science advisor and former head of the NIH. In talking about Dr. Fauci, however, as well as Kim's disdain for our COVID response, the Great Reset, and other things, it's the establishment versus populist paradigm itself that I sought to engage Kim on most in this episode. Populism, whether left or right, is a concern to many observers. But I do think that within the populist spirit of American politics, we can actually find clues to some of the common ground that can actually unite us in a way that transcends left and right. There are a lot of things that make me say that. You'll hear us give voice to some of it in this discussion. But here's an anecdote that illustrates the point. I have a friend and mentor named Harry Boyd. Harry is a professor of public work at Augsburg University. His father was the only white man on the board of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And as a teenager, he worked on the ground organizing poor whites in the South for Dr. King. In the spring of '64, while helping organize a citizenship school in St. Augustine, Florida, now the citizenship schools were where many of the foot soldiers of the movement were brought up in civics and nonviolence, he visited a fellow civil rights organizer who had been jailed just outside of town. When Harry had stepped out of the jail, however, he found himself surrounded by a half-dozen members of the Ku Klux Klan. They accused him of being a Yankee and a communist, to which Harry responded by saying, "You got all that wrong. I love black Americans and Southerners, but I ain't no communist. I'm a populist. I believe that y'all are being used. You're being tricked by the big shots. You should be on our side." Well, Harry had frozen them in their tracks. They didn't expect him to say that. The leader of the small band thumbed the straps of his overalls for a moment and finally responded by saying something like, "There's something in that." Now, I don't think those KKK members joined the civil rights movement, but they did let Harry go on his way. So why do I bring up that story? Dr. King died trying to bring together poor white and black people in this country. And today, in our time, as far apart as we see BLM and MAGA as being politically, it nevertheless remains the fact that black and white, urban and rural, people who feel themselves locked out of the American dream ought to be able to see more that they can empathize with in each other's experiences than our polarized environment generally allows for them to see. We can't settle for shared resentments of the establishment as a bridge to unity, of course. But recognizing similar experiences and common interests is a start. And maybe populism can help us get that ball rolling. In any event, I was grateful for this conversation with my dear friend Kim, and I'm grateful that you get to hear it. So without further ado, Kim Iversen. Welcome to Uniting America with John Wood Jr.
Thank you. Good to be here trying to unite America.
Yeah.
We'll do our best.
We'll do our best. We'll see how we do.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Well, so I'm excited about this for a couple of reasons. One, you are my inaugural guest in studio. Anyway, we'll see when this actually sort of...
Happy to be here.
Yeah, right? Yeah. So,
yeah, what an honor.
Yeah,
to be the first.
Well, right, indeed.
To unite America.
Right. And, I felt good about that because you and I are, at this point, kind of old friends.
Yeah. At what point is it classified as old friends? Like, is it because we're old?
No, that's what I meant. I have no idea how long we've been friends. We're just old people who happen to be friends.
Oh, right. Yeah. So we are old friends. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. And so, I mean, there's a little bit of a vision behind this podcast, and it is to sort of have deep conversations that explore sort of like deep fault lines in American society, in American politics, but to emerge as friends at the end of it, if at all possible, right? And so,
we might end up enemies at the end of this. Right? No, we won't.
It might,
of course not.
Might backfire, but I feel like we've got a pretty good record.
Yeah.
The friendship's going pretty strong.
It is. So. And we've always known we're politically a bit different. So we've been able to manage through that.
So far.
Yeah.
So far. Yeah. We'll put it to the test. Yeah.
And you even married me.
I did.
Yeah. Not like in the way, not in the way of, not that we're married.
No. But it's nice to let the confusion linger for a second.
Yeah.
No, I presided.
Yes.
Over
You're the
Kim
officiant
Iverson's.
at my wedding. Yes.
I was.
Which thank you. Very, very excellent. Beautiful wedding.
Yeah.
You did a fantastic job.
Now I got a whole side career available.
That's right. So. If you want to be I will attest to your abilities as being an officiant, and your children as well. If I told you if you wanted to have them be professional ring bearers and flower girls, and you've got an entire industry within your family.
Yeah, definitely. I'm hiring them out as wedding kids.
Yeah, your wife is a bridesmaid. She was my bridesmaid. So the whole family should be in a catalog.
Yeah. There you go. So now that the Wood Iverson family, uniting has been clarified.
Yes.
Here. Let's get to something that I think is deep division in American political life. Well, actually, let me put it to you this way. I wanted to have you on to talk about something that I think doesn't always announce itself as the sort of most salient division in American political society, but I think that you could easily argue that it is. Most of the time we go to thinking about the right-left divide. We might go to thinking about the sort of left, black-white divide, racial divisions, maybe religion, secular, so on and so forth. But I think that you can easily argue that there is sort of a populist establishment divide in American politics that transcends party in some serious way.
At this point in time, yeah.
So I want us to get into that subject. But before we do, I do want to know, one, do you agree with that assessment? It sounds like you do. And two, where do you see yourself in that kind of, spectrum of things? Because I was interested in having you talk to the subject because I think a lot of people sort of look at you as a populist.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if that label sits right with you and just sort of how you would describe that divide.
Yeah. I mean, I do consider myself a populist. I've come from traditionally the left end of the spectrum. I would consider myself an independent at this point. I do think that the greatest divide right now in America is actually that populist establishment divide without people really realizing it. I think a lot of people haven't been able to quite label it. They don't fully understand. They don't know it's the populist establishment. They just know there are people they agree with and people they don't agree with. And and they're not, they haven't been able to categorize it quite yet. I think most people, you're right, think about things from a left-right perspective. But a lot of people right now are becoming very confused because they're hearing people from the other side of the aisle that are echoing many of their same sentiments. So they're thinking, wait a minute, but I always thought I disagreed with Republicans, but now here I am agreeing with Sarah Palin that Julian Assange should be given complete, that he should be completely pardoned, that he doesn't even need to be pardoned. They should just drop the charges against him. They should just let him, free Assange. That's something that even now Sarah Palin is saying, and she is somebody who is a Republican, somebody who I never really agreed with in other aspects. But suddenly I find myself agreeing with her. I find myself agreeing with people like Matt Gaetz on similar issues when it comes to Snowden and Assange, when it comes to the establishment anti-war positions. Somebody for myself, somebody who's always been, I was a Bernie Sanders supporter, came from, the only party I really ever registered for was Green Party. I was never a Democrat or anything, but I would vote mostly Democrat if I were to vote.
Right.
That changed. That's completely changed at this point. I don't think I'll vote for a single Democrat at this point going forward for a long time. But I do think that there is this divide that is more populist versus the establishment. And the establishment is, I think, using a lot of the a lot of cultural issues to try to divide us, to get us to remain distracted on that populist versus the establishment. Because that really is, the establishment is like the old guard. I want to say like the modern or a new age monarchy in a way, where we've got these elites and they're running the system. They're running the show. They give us this sense of a democracy. But in the end, we're not really deciding on a lot of the biggest, most important things that we should be deciding on, like war, for example. That is supposed to be something that we, the people, delegate Congress to vote on. They don't declare war anymore. They find every other way to go around it. And so they never have to actually cast a vote and then be held accountable to the people.
Well, let me pause you there just to ask you, in the interest of clarity, are there any meaningful differences between, let's say, the establishment, left and right, or, populist movements, left and right? Trying to get it sort of like how relevant our terms are. So, I mean, is there not meaningful differences between, let's say, Hillary Clinton and Mitt Romney on the one hand, or between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump on the other?
The differences are minor. They're not as major as people think they are. Certainly, I would say the difference between the populists and the establishment is much greater than the difference between right and left populists with each other, or the difference between right and left establishment with one another. Those are minor differences. I would say that on the establishment side of things, the left-right establishment between Mitt Romney or Hillary Clinton, I have a difficult time figuring out where they actually are different. Fiscally, maybe a bit different. Hillary Clinton will maybe vote for more programs for the people, with a lot of earmarks for her donors. And Mitt Romney might vote against that because he doesn't want to spend money. So there's a bit of a fiscal difference between the two. But when it comes to military conflict, there's no difference when it comes to foreign policy. There's no real difference. As much as they try to play against each other on the culture war, and they say, one side says, well, the other one's a racist, and the other one says, well, no, they're the real racists. I mean, everybody kind of slings this back and forth at one another. And I'm not 100% certain there's a huge difference, except for just what they claim the other one is.
Now, is that because, in your point of view, and maybe others, that the interests that stand behind sort of the establishment factions are themselves more or less the same? Does the idea that there's sort of an establishment that transcends party rest upon the idea that the thing that sort of unites them in an invisible way, so to speak, is perhaps corporate interests?
Well, there's certainly a lot of that. Yeah. I mean, when you look at Big Pharma, for example, and the military-industrial complex, they've bought off both parties almost equally at this point. There was a time when they weren't. There was a time when Big Pharma spent way more money on Republicans than on Democrats, but now they actually spend more money on Democrats than they do on Republicans. Same thing with the military-industrial complex. It used to be way more Republicans, but now it's shifted. So certainly, I think that has been the difference. I think there was a time when maybe the Democratic Party was a bit more populist, and there was a time in history when the Republican Party was more populist, back when you go back to Teddy Roosevelt's era. But through time, the big corporate interests have been able to buy off both sides pretty equally. I mean, there are some differences. Like, of course, you've got Planned Parenthood buying off the Democrats way more so than NRA buying off Republicans, right? They don't give any money to Democrats, the NRA. Planned Parenthood doesn't give any to Republicans, or if it is, it's very minor. I don't think there is any, though. But so you've got these like culture war issues that are definitely keeping those two establishment sides divided. But beyond that, fundamentally, they're exactly the same in every other way. They do just vote a little bit differently fiscally. Obviously, Republicans tend to be more for states' rights. They want things done on a state level. Democrats want things done on a federal level. But a lot of the stuff on a day-to-day, the things that people care about, they end up being the exact same, and nothing really fundamentally changes.
Well, let's hit the populist side of this now, because surely there's got to be real differences between, the movement forces that Bernie Sanders represented, and you said that you were Bernie Sanders supporter, versus what Donald Trump represented, or are
Not
there,
really.
right? Okay, now that sounds like a spicy take to me somehow, right?
Well,
Explain that to me then.
You've got a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters who voted for Donald Trump. You know, when it was Hillary Clinton and Trump, they voted for Trump because they actually said many of the same things. You know, Trump obviously says them in a crass way that is, you know, he has no manners. But really, they're fundamentally saying very similar things. I mean, Bernie Sanders was also not for open immigration. He was saying that we need to keep things controlled because we're trying to raise wages in this country. And if you keep importing in low wage workers, that kills the opportunity for workers in this country to raise their wages. So Bernie Sanders wasn't for the open border policy. Donald Trump kept saying build a wall, but they're saying the same thing essentially for the same fundamental reason. I mean, they're both saying we need to keep America for Americans and all the benefits of America for Americans, and we need to strengthen that. When you look at foreign policy, they were both, let's end the wars, let's focus on America. They were both very much, let's focus on America and focus on the American people. When you talk about, I mean, pretty much, you know, free speech and going against the deep state, I mean, they're both very much in that line of thinking. So there really isn't a ton of differences. I mean, you've got, again, you know, some of the fiscal differences, like you've got Bernie Sanders saying he wants Medicare for all. That was his big, you know, key platform position. But, and that was something that Trump wasn't. That wasn't his key platform position. But he didn't necessarily, he didn't disagree clearly with lowering the cost of everything. I mean, in fact, under his presidency is when they made it to where there had to be transparency in the costs of medical. So if you were to, you know, they need to tell you how much procedures are going to cost in advance. You should be able to call, you need to see price lists. Under his presidency, price lists are now made available for your procedures and medicines. Under his presidency, it was deregulated that you would be able to import drugs from other countries. So there was a concerted effort from the Trump campaign to also lower the cost of medical in unconventional ways that were against the establishment. That's the difference, because Trump wanting to import drugs from Canada, let's say, and allow that to happen, that was against what the medical big pharma wanted. They want to control the prices here in the United States. They don't want you to be able to get medicines for cheap out of Canada. Now, Bernie Sanders might say, now he was doing that. He was for that as well. But Bernie wants the cost of actual medicines in the United States to lower by saying we need to allow the government to negotiate the drug prices, right? So they both were going for those lower drug prices, just in slightly different ways of doing it. However, they were both against the establishment on that. The establishment did not want that. They wanted to control the prices themselves. They want to be able to price gouge you. That's what their goal is, and that's what their donors are paying all of these politicians to continue to vote for.
Now, would left and right populists have a difference of opinion on this healthcare subject, in particular, in terms of, you know, which side's approach really does represent sort of a selling out to some form of an establishment? So in other words, you know, one thing that I think is true about not just, you know, Donald Trump, but also, you know, just Republican politicians in general, is that they reject the notion of universal health, or at least single payer healthcare, right? And I think that for many folks on the right, there's a sense that, well, that's giving all the power to the government, right, to the federal government. And that's something to be pushed back against. Whereas, you know, I would imagine, you know, Bernie Sanders, or we know Bernie Sanders, and folks on the left would tend to say that anything short of that is some kind of a capitulation to the corporate, to big pharma, but also to just sort of the corporate healthcare industry in general. Is that not a fundamental sort of division between populists on the left and right, or do you see that as less relevant than some of the other things?
I think that the left side of that has shifted a bit after the pandemic. So I would say that was absolutely the big fundamental divide, is that one side would say, I don't want the government to fully control. I want there to be options. That's why the big question in every single presidential debate kept being, would you eliminate private insurance? They kept asking that. Would you eliminate it? Right. Giving people no option other than the government-controlled healthcare. And that was something that was a big concern for the populists more on the right. They wanted the Medicare for all option. I mean, most Americans do believe that there should be some form of medical for everybody. But the divide is, like you just mentioned, on the left, more people say get rid of the industry entirely because they will always find their way in. They will always figure out a way to undercut the system and to bring it back to the way they want. And the other side says, I don't want to eliminate my options of private insurance, right? I want to be able to have it kind of like schools, You have the option of sending your kid to a public school, but you also have the choice of sending them to a private school if you're willing to pay for it, right?
Yeah.
So I do think that has been a fundamental divide on that particular issue. But I do think that on the left, the populists on the left, the true populists, have also shifted their mentality on that a bit since the pandemic, because they've seen what government control of medical looks like.
Right.
And that is scary to many of us. So I've even switched my position on that, where although I was never for eradicating private, but even now more so, I definitely don't think the government should be in 100% control over healthcare. But there is a way to ensure, and I think most Americans want to figure out a way to ensure everybody has medical care.
Right. Okay. Well, let's keep going with the analysis here a bit, because there are a couple of other facets of this that I'm curious to get you to dig into a little bit. So when we talk about the establishment, it seems to me that obviously that's a big blanket term.
Yeah.
And it seems like there are components of what is meant by that are specifically captured by some other terms that I think folks have a difficult time wrestling with. One of them is this phrase deep state, right? And so, Steve Bannon, who was he was President Trump's one of his early, campaign managers or campaign strategists? And then he went into the White House with Trump for a period of time. And since then, Bannon's been at the center of any number of controversies, and I guess maybe behind bars at some point here. But Bannon said early on that while he was still in the administration, that every day was going to be a fight to, quote, deconstruct the administrative state. With the idea being that there are these entrenched classes of bureaucrats and civil servants and so forth, whose job it is to sort of hold in place the interests, I guess, of the establishment. But I mean, meaning, any number of things. I mean, certainly the FBI and the intelligence services, major government agencies and so forth. And that they are resistant, I guess, to the will of the American people. Let's start with so that's one. The other thing I want to get to in a moment is the idea of there being sort of a global or globalist establishment, because we hear a lot about globalism, the globalists. And on your show, you've talked a lot about sort of the World Economic Forum. I think you, and not just you on the left, folks, particularly I think of Glenn Beck and others on the right, we're very concerned about the Great Reset and all these things. So I want to hit these things. But starting with the deep state and the sort of bureaucratic, the inner bureaucratic kind of reality of American government. Do folks on the left and the right both perceive this as an issue? And how do you understand the idea of the deep state? Do you agree with it?
The populist sides, for sure, not the establishment sides.
Right,
the establishment sides think it's all a bunch of conspiracy theories. But those of us on the populist side, both left and right, absolutely are concerned about what would, I guess, be called the deep state, which is essentially, there's many layers to what that term would mean. Right. So on one level, you, of course, do have your day-to-day government working bureaucrats, right? You've got the people that they're unelected people. They work behind the scenes. They work through administration after administration after administration. They don't change. And those people, like all people, human nature is to not like change. Nobody likes change. Okay. So even when a new administration comes in, what you've got is a resistance that naturally is there, not in the same, and I don't mean resistance like the resistance against Trump or anything, but there is a natural resistance of any employee when they get a new boss to change, right? And especially when you have to change every 4 years, it becomes, people just don't. They just don't want this is the way it's been done. This is the way we're going to keep doing it. We're not going to actually change things. So you do have like the bureaucratic forces that are working against every single president that comes in, whether they be coming from the left or the right. Anybody who wants to make significant change is going to be up against a wall of resistance from people that just don't like change. But I think really the deep state more so is referring to the big corporate interests that are controlling the actual, what should be democratic levers of society. So rather than we, the people, making decisions on what we want and our politicians, our representatives voting in the way that we want, they instead vote the way their big money interests want. So there is this other unelected way more influential than your average Joe working 9 to 5 in in DC. An extremely influential body that is fundamentally controlling the government because these government officials are not voting. They're not representing the people. They're representing their donors. And that is something that populists on the left and the right care about. In fact, on the left more so, that has been a concern coming from the progressive left for a much longer time. Bernie Sanders being really the catalyst of do not accept big money, no large corporate donors to his campaigns, small dollar donations only. That has then crept over to the right. You do have some Republicans also shunning corporate PAC money, like Matt Gaetz. You've got I want to Ken Buck. I want to say his last name is from Colorado, a rep from Colorado. So you've got these various, on both sides starting to just say, we've got to get rid of the big money interests. We have to represent the people. But that is not a popular position, surprisingly, even though it seems like it should be the most popular of the positions. So that would be the deep state. It's the big money interests that are really, truly the ones behind the scenes controlling our politicians, controlling policy. They're helping write the policy. They're actually bringing in their own advisors to help craft, the policy that should be for the people. So
now, special interest driven politics is not necessarily a new thing, but you're saying that the deep state sort of is this set of interests, or is it this set of interests combined with the fact that you have these career civil servants who are basically sort of in position for extended periods of time in a way to where they are the beneficiaries of that. And that's the relationship that endures, right? So, they talk about, the president of the United States. Sometimes you'll hear people who are like, staffers or folks who are like, not people who are political appointees, but who are there for a long period of time, say, you refer to them as like the seasonal help, elected officials, because there's turnover there and so forth, right? So it's sort of just an inevitable consequence of the idea that people who are unelected are more closely bound to the institutions than they are to sort of the checks and balances of actual voters. Is that the fundamental problem?
I mean, I would say that the day-to-day working bureaucrat is not necessarily they're not as much of the deep state as the larger, more influential controlling features of the donors and the policymakers. So I would say there is certainly, the careerist is certainly a problem, but not, it depends on the level of that careerist. So there are some that are, high level that have been working through various administrations, like Antony Blinken, for example, right? So he was the Undersecretary of State during the Obama administration, and now he's the Secretary of State in the Biden administration. So we see this revolving door. And what did he do in the meantime? He went and he started West Exec Advisors, which is an advisory firm to help with the military industrial complex and, big money interests there. So
the revolving
it's
door
a revolving door
between the government, between these various, agencies and the moneyed interest. That's what the deep state becomes in your view here.
Yeah. We're not getting fresh people in there. Everybody's got a money interest. The people that are working inside of the government now are thinking of their next move in 4 years when they're getting fired.
Got it.
Somebody else gets elected. They got to go. Where do they go? They go lobby. They go lobby for these organizations. So it's not just members of Congress that go to K Street. It's also their staff that go to K Street. Right. And then those staff come back and work on the Hill. And it's this revolving door of, the big money interest and everybody looking out for their next career move.
Got it. Okay.
And these people are getting wealthy off of it.
So that starts to fill it out for me a bit more here. Can you connect that to this other piece, which I find interesting, which is sort of the globalist kind of piece? So I think that for many folks, I hear this, I hear so much of this on the left and the right about the establishment in general and things that, I hear the term deep state, I think more on the right, but I hear a lot of things on the left that seem to be pointing in the same direction.
Yeah.
On the right, at least, I certainly hear people talking about sort of, I think we all kind of like got familiar with the phrase like New World Order, kind of a while back and so forth. That has got like this Illuminati ring to it and so forth.
It seems that way,
but so many people really are concerned about something that right now is well, there's a particular phrase that's sort of in vogue at the moment called the Great Reset, which comes out of conversations taking place at the World Economic Forum.
Well, they call it the Great Reset.
Yeah, right. They call it the Great Reset.
They have an entire website dedicated to it.
Right, precisely. And now that phrase is now being understood as sort of an agenda of sort of international elites, at the forum, but I think manifest in other places, aimed at fundamentally transforming the ways in which sort of political and economic society work, and that, perhaps entities like, the folks at the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, and high-level international politicians are taking advantage of current crises, particularly, the pandemic, through policies like lockdowns and so forth, to begin to sort of re-engineer the way global society works in general, and certainly sort of, Western industrialized society,
right,
and American society. One, I'm curious to know, like, is that a reasonable kind of just high-level description of what people perceive? And second, do you see there as being sort of a global kind of establishment that we should be concerned about in this way?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's the same.
And does that make you a wild-eyed conspiracy theorist?
Well, people call me that. So, I mean, even though it's flat out said by the World Economic Forum, I mean, they proudly proclaim this stuff. They actually say, you will own nothing and you will be happy. They actually say you will own nothing, you will have no privacy, and you will have never been happier. They flat out say that. That is not something that, I mean, you could go through the World Economic Forum's Twitter account and find those phrases. You can read articles that are published in Forbes and in other places where they detail this out of what that would look like in the year they project, like 2030 or 2035, where you will own nothing and you will be happy, and you'll be monitored by whoever, you won't have privacy. You will be monitored and it'll all be okay. Everything will be fine. Just do what you need to do. Just, don't go against the government and everything will be just fine. They don't quite say that last phrase, but they say everything else very blatantly to our faces. So they're not hiding this. This is not a conspiracy theory. They tell us, and they're saying what their goal is, what their stated goal is, to create basically one world government, where rather than us being divided, it would be similar to the United States, but United Nations in a way, right? Where it's united countries coming together and there's one governing body, and all of the people in the entire world live by the same set of rules. And I think that this kind of stemmed from, and this is where you get into the, the conspiracy theories of population control, because this, or depopulation, because really what this kind of stemmed from was the rapid increasing of the global population. I think when I was calculating it out, I think in my dad's lifetime alone, so he's like 75 years old, I think the world population has tripled since he was born, the global population. I mean, that's in one person's lifetime. We're breeding like rabbits, right? I mean, we're really increasing. And so there is definitely a concern by some that when you get too great of a population, it's too difficult to control, right? Too difficult to keep order when there's too many people involved. They could rise up and they can easily overtake you, right? So they can overthrow you. So there is this sort of idea that we've got to get everything under control. We've got to maintain order as we increase this massive population. Okay. And some people then think, or maybe even lower the population.
Is it kind of ironic because we're talking about, I mean, when we're talking about sort of the World Economic Forum in particular, you're talking about a gathering of very wealthy people in general.
Well, right? Many of them are very, the people that are invited to Davos are extremely wealthy technocrats, oligarchs, and politicians who may or may not be wealthy. Right. And if they're not wealthy now, they will be wealthy later. I mean, that's kind of usually how it works in politics, unfortunately. So, yeah, there's a lot of high-level people that are, you've got people in positions of power that are, Justin Trudeau's of the world, the people, Jacinda Ardern down in New Zealand, very much involved in the World Economic Forum, and they're people in positions of leadership, and then they're mingling and they're mixing with the people who have all the money. So you've got the power of the government mixed with the money people. They get together and they're in a club, and it's a very big club that is running much of the Western world, and they have an agenda, and that agenda is that they want to reconfigure the way our society looks, the way we consume, the way we interact on a global level. So they're very blatant about their agenda. They want it to be where we don't own anything, but the corporations own everything. Okay. And then we just rent everything from the corporations. Right. They do have this concerted agenda, or I think a fair assessment is that a lot of people point towards communism and say that it's really kind of going more towards a communist model or like the China model.
Is this international socialism? Is that more or less what it boils down to?
I mean, I
something a little bit more
I wouldn't use
nuanced than that.
It's more new. I wouldn't use those terms necessarily. Like, it's not really communism or socialism. It's not either of those things, but it's something that would be akin to it in that you don't personally own anything. Everything is rented to you or borrowed, mostly rented to you. And it is owned, though, by technocrats, mostly. Okay. And, well, they don't really specify, to be honest, who owns it. But you could just kind of assume it must be the technocrats, like Jeff Bezos of the world, that are already running so much of it.
Got it. Okay. Well, let's tie this to some particular areas of concern, including one where your outspokenness has, I think, in ways that many of your fans, I think all your fans at this point will be, somewhat familiar with, has maybe landed you in the hot seat and to have some high-level disagreements with an employer of yours. So, one thing that you are very much known for is, I think, pretty scathing criticisms of the United States and also, I think, the state of California in particular, where we both happen to be, response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so you've laid out for us, you've helped us to understand sort of how not just you, but many Americans, left and right, sort of perceive kind of the larger, establishment domestically and internationally, and sort of the agendas that maybe come through that. But I think that, in your view, that really cashed out perhaps in the way some elected officials and politicians maybe seem to take advantage of the COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns. I want to talk about different facets of that, but I think that one thing I want to draw attention to here is, I think, not just your concern, but the concern of many right and left, which is that part of the way people in power operate is to want to silence dissent, right? To want to not have certain conversations that need to be had. And so you've been a big critic of Dr. Anthony Fauci, who, of course, sort of the leading public health authority in the United States, with whom we associate sort of, the public response to the COVID-19 pandemic most visibly. And so, you were a prominent voice on a program called The Hill Rising, which, and you guys had a great show there, right? Strong following. And Dr. Fauci was recently interviewed on The Hill. And yet Kim Iversen was sort of absent from that conversation. Do you want to recap that just a little bit here?
Yeah, as you mentioned, that was what I mostly, I was the one on the show that had covered COVID the most, right? Definitely was me. I battled my co-hosts on a regular basis publicly for the world to see, where I would say, that the vaccines don't stop the spread, or, a variety of things that were considered insane that now everybody says, okay, it is what it is, right? Now it's kind of common knowledge. And definitely criticized Fauci, definitely criticized the responses. And when an interview with Fauci was booked, I found out about it, and I was then told by the producers that I was being excluded from that interview. So that definitely, I had spent a year on that show. I didn't leave totally my independent show that I had going, but definitely put a big pause on it and was working on The Hills Rising. And I told my followers prior to joining that program that even though it was corporate media, that I was not going to be controlled by corporate media. That yes, I was going back to the big mean machine of corporate, but that they were allowing me to say what I wanted to say, that they were not holding me back. And as long as that continued, then I would stick around. And that was true for the most, really, they never held me back. No one ever censored my radars or told me I didn't have to run by my topics by anybody. I just did as long as I could back it up with facts, I was free to say what I wanted to say. Mm. But when they decided to exclude me from the Fauci interview was when, unfortunately, I said this would be reputationally ruining for me to stick around after being excluded from this, when I've told everybody for a year I wasn't going to be limited or censored or held back in any way. And this will not only kill my reputation if I stuck around after this, but this is also going to kill yours, because the audience is not stupid, and they're going to see that your main anchor at this point is missing from this interview. It's,
and people were definitely upset. I read the Twitter comments.
Yeah. I mean, people caught on before I even said anything. I mean, everybody in the comment section was like, normally they would say in segments, if I was missing, where's Kim? That was pretty normal. But in this one, they were saying, how dare you? How dare you do this to Kim? Like, how even in the comments, people were saying, how could Kim possibly come back after this? And they were right. What they didn't know was I had already told the company, you've put me in a position where I can't come back. And so I asked them not to do it. They had every opportunity to not go forward with that interview. The day before, the day of, the morning of, they then conducted the interview. They didn't post it for another 2 hours. I begged them not to do it. I told them what the consequences would have to be, that I would have no choice but to leave. And they proceeded to do it anyway. So they had every opportunity to not make that big mistake.
Now, would you say that that's part of a larger pattern? Is there sort of, because you'll certainly have, many folks, and again, this is right and left. I think the terminology is different. On the right, you'll have a lot of people complaining about the mainstream media not wanting to, touch certain popular, usually sort of Democratic politicians, but then you'll have folks on the left talking about the corporate media, which sort of wants to, to keep its hands, off of really sort of scrutinizing, sort of the intense kind of like class of, if you will, establishment politicians.
It's a problem.
Are they playing defense for powerful people in sort of, the corporate media, would you say?
Right. They are in a variety. So yes, for one, news media relies on advertising dollars. So of course, if you've got Pfizer spending all of its money on you, you're going to be careful about criticizing Pfizer, right? But secondly, it's just incestuous in DC. Right. And it's a small town. And everybody knows each other, and they're all running into each other at cocktail parties, and nobody wants to be the person not invited to anything. So one of the biggest issues is it is a swamp, and it definitely is. It's an incestuous swamp in a way where, you've got politicians or high level corporate people married to news people who are married to, it's politicians married to big money interests, married to news, married to, it's all like one big family. And so they don't want to offend one another. They don't want to, like I said, not be invited to the holiday party. They want to continue beneficial relationships because they want to get the next interview. They think that that's going to benefit them. It doesn't. So, that is really the fundamental, I'd say a bigger issue than the advertising dollars is the familial relationships. You've got like a perfect example, Andrew Cuomo and Chris Cuomo, right? That was that's a showcasing of exactly what I'm talking about. That happened publicly. That ended up having to have actual consequences, but most of them don't have consequences.
Sure. Because so governors, and remind us here, so Governor Andrew Cuomo
going on Chris Cuomo's show on CNN on a regular basis, making jokes with large Q-tips and things. Chris Cuomo not doing his job as a reporter.
Well, all the time Andrew Cuomo was,
people were dying in nursing homes.
Yes, you had people dying in nursing homes, but he also, and in addition to some personal scandals with respect to his own treatment of women in his office and so forth. And so Chris Cuomo, it seems, was actually sort of advising him in terms of how to sort of manage his public response.
And softening the blow. I mean, making sure that he didn't get the bad press on CNN.
Because Chris Cuomo was in a position to do that.
Right. So it's that incestuous relationship between the power, the big money interests, and the media that has caused this issue. Okay. So it is not as much as it definitely, the advertising dollars is a part of it for sure. That definitely plays a big part in it. That the fact that media relies on advertisers. But, if one advertiser goes away, if they've got the numbers, another advertiser comes along. So it's not as big of an issue as just the relationships inside of those organizations. They're all friends and family in many cases, and they don't want to criticize each other. They don't go hard on each other. And that is why, particularly, and that's why we're seeing this throughout, like, even organizations like New York Times, Washington Post, everything seems to be liberal now, right? Yeah. Because it's all become like a breeding ground of people marrying people and being involved. And it's, we're seeing this play out. Now people are kind of being held accountable for it a bit, like Chris and Andrew. Even Mark Zucker, who was running CNN, got called out for a relationship with a coworker. And but just that those relationships and keeping them like that is really causing people to go soft on each other.
I see. Okay. All right. So let me try and do this. Now you are somebody who's looked sort of, very, I think very deeply at a lot of avenues of real or perceived corruption in American politics in ways that, I would fully admit, like your insights in a lot of particular areas sort of, outstrips mine. I do think of myself as being an institutionalist in a real way. I say that not thinking of myself at all as being like an anti-populist. I do feel like democracy is about the will of the people. But I do feel like, you need sort of strong institutions in a complex society because we have to do so many different things. And I think that ideally, we would have people in every sort of part of American society, institutionally speaking, trying to serve a function for the common sort of welfare, right? So, I mean, if you're in the law, you ought to be concerned with justice. If you're in the academy, you ought to be concerned with truth. If you're in Congress, you ought to be concerned with representing the will of the people. So let me try and give something of a defense of like the institutional classes and the establishment.
But before you do that, just to know, populists aren't anarchists.
Right.
I mean, we're not against institutions. It's just who's controlling the institutions.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Well, actually, so let me challenge you with a question here, because I see what you're saying about the relationships that get sticky and problematic, so to speak. Right? Yeah. But, one of the reasons why, so to jump back to the deep state for a second, it used to be a period of time in American history where all of these were, positions within the government were satisfied through political appointments, right? You'd have a new administration come in, kick everybody else out who was there before, bring in a whole new crop of people. And with something, I think it was, Civil Service Act was passed in the late 19th century. The idea was to sort of create sort of a landscape of positions that weren't subject to the political whims of an incoming or outgoing administration, that you would have people there to sort of operate the machinery of government whose positions weren't so directly tied to the interests of a partisan administration, right? And so, perhaps that opens up the possibility that you're going to have long-serving, bureaucrats, civil servants, people in fixed positions who then develop, relationships with moneyed interests and so forth over time. But what is the alternative to that other than making everybody subject to just sort of, political appointments and so forth, and allowing everything to be sort of in a partisan kind of lens? I mean, how do we eliminate the possibility of, of sticky relationships between, entrenched interest and longstanding sort of, government officials, without just having everything be up to, the political whims of Donald Trump or Barack Obama or whoever the Democrat or Republican serving in the White House may happen to be?
Well, I think there's a few ways to go about it, but first is to end the revolving door. So we have to stop the ability for Congress members or aides or anybody who works in those bureaucratic positions to then go and become lobbyists. I think you have to choose your career path and you're stuck with it, So I think that, and I understand that people like to have their freedom and be able to go and do what they want. And after they've served in a government position, go in and work. Maybe they want the freedom to work for a lobbying firm, but it's not creating freedom for the American people. So we need to end the ability for that. You have to choose your track. Are you going to be a lobbyist or are you going to be working in the government? Take your pick. Okay. You don't get to have both. So that needs to end. I think that would solve a huge amount of the problem right there.
Would you also prohibit people with, let's say, who formerly were occupying a corporate position in a certain industry, let's say like maybe the energy sector, not being allowed to serve in a regulatory, body that, surveils that's meant to sort of rein in the energy sector, or people who have worked for big banks, not being allowed to, then go into operate as regulators because they're coming out of the energy? Would the revolving door be shut in that instance as well? Because you can always argue that, people who are operating the regulatory mechanisms of government might benefit from having had some experience within the industries. And that is sort of a practical reason for there being a little bit of back and forth between the two.
You could certainly make that argument. I think that when it comes to the regulation, the bigger problem isn't people coming from the industries. It's so much as the politicians are having these industries as their donors. Okay. So if you are on the committee to regulate banking, you shouldn't be then going to fundraisers where there's a bunch of bankers giving your campaign a bunch of money, right? So you shouldn't be allowed to take any donations whatsoever from any entity that is connected to the industry you are regulating. So the regulation comes from the politicians. So that I would say is that funding needs to end. You cannot go and seek out massive amounts of funding from the industry you're regulating.
So you think that campaign finance reform is a necessary part of strengthening the credibility of our institutions, because it would help affect that separation between the money classes and the elected officials, and therefore the people they appoint, the policies that they enact.
Yeah, we need to make sure that our politicians are working in the best interest of the American people. And part of that does include businesses and corporations. Of course, we need to have a strong economy, so they need to be represented as well, but that's why it needs to be neutral. It needs to be the politician, the representative is seeing things from all angles, getting information from those career, aides that are there through administration after administration, who then just gives advisement and says, here's the information. This is what would potentially happen if you put this regulation on these corporations. This is what would happen if you didn't. And this is how it benefits the people. This is how it hurts the people. This is how it benefits the corporation. This is how it hurts the corporation. And then the representative would hopefully make a decision based on what is actually in the best interest of the people and the country, rather than just representing their donors because they're looking for their next campaign, finance opportunity so that they can continue to remain in power. Right now, they're just paying attention to, how am I going to get reelected?
Right. Okay.
So maybe even term limits is definitely another option. But I don't think that solves the problem, because a lot of times what happens is these politicians then go and they revolve into a lobbying position or sit on the board of one of these companies. And then they go and they call their friends who they served with in Congress for years. And they say, hey, now I'm on the board of Raytheon. How about that military package?
And that doesn't really look good to anybody. And yet it's the type of thing that sort of continues to happen, right? Because you have, as you said, you have people who operate on these rungs of society. They know each other well and so forth. And I think that, people in industries, I think that they do oftentimes look at themselves as providing sort of, wealth and adding value back into society and so forth. And that their interests maybe are, sort of such that through these special relationships, they have the opportunity to sort of, not that they're in business to be idealistic or, to necessarily serve the American people, but that there's some justification for it. But at the same time, it makes it very difficult for people to sort of trust the culture of government when these are the relationships that kind of, animate what's going on. So you've been shining a light on that basically your whole career.
Right. Yeah. Well, since I've been doing my independent media stuff. But also, I don't think it's a bad idea to maybe eliminate Washington, D.C. in a way.
That's not a radical statement.
What I mean is we're living in a new era, right? Where we have now, with the COVID pandemic, we've learned that people can work remotely. I mean, look, I was broadcasting. I mean, I was an anchor on the Hill that is based in DC, the studio's in DC, and I'm in Los Angeles. And I was still, it didn't hurt the views at all as far as me not being there. So we can all work remotely. I think that there is maybe something to be said for these politicians, these bureaucrats, these getting away from each other and not having the ability to mingle and marry and have, like I said, those incestuous relationships between the industries.
So tell me, how does that manifest in, or does that problem show up in our response to COVID-19? What were your big beefs with the way that was handled, either through the public health establishment in general, the state of California in particular? Is the establishment class sort of, explicitly to blame for problems that fell out from that? Because I think that many people feel that, Anthony Fauci and the larger health establishment were following the science in efforts to control an unprecedented problem and an unprecedented threat to the literal physical health of not just the American people, but global society. Why is that analysis wrong?
Because they weren't following any of the science at all.
All right, I'm here with my good brother, Wilk Wilkinson. Wilk, how you doing, man?
Doing very well, John. How are you?
I'm good, my friend. I am good. And so we are going to show a quick clip in just a second between a fascinating Braver Angels debate that we had featuring none other than Dr. Francis Collins, Chief Science Advisor to President Biden, formerly head of the National Institute of Health, and yourself. As somebody who's been a bit critical of the public health establishment, but who is also a leader at Braver Angels. Well, could you do me a favor and just tell folks a little bit about kind of where you come from politically right off the bat? How would you describe your politics really fast?
Yeah, I can certainly do that. I consider myself a constitutional conservative, very much an originalist in a lot of ways. I'm a Christian. I'm a family man. I got a wife and children, and grew up in the Midwest, so live with a lot of those, traditional conservative hometown values, and that's kind of how I operate when it comes to politics.
There you go. Down home type of guy. That tells us something. And tell us a little bit about your work with Braver Angels. I mean, what do you do as a part of Braver Angels community organization? What sort of oar are you rowing in the ship that we're all on?
Well, John, I'm part of the We the People's Project leadership committee. The We the People's Project started out of the Working People's Project, and it kind of transformed into the We the People's Project here. And what it was it's kind of a project within Braver Angels where it gives people the opportunity, people who are seldom spoken to but often spoken of. So it gives those people a voice at the microphone. It gives them people an opportunity to speak their mind, get their feelings out there, get their opinions and their mindsets heard when they otherwise probably wouldn't have.
That's right. And we know that the voices of working class Americans, like you said, are often overlooked in our discourse. And so that's a big reason why at Brave Angels, we do the best that we can to uplift folks coming from a working background, because we know that they are driving so much of American society and need to be a major part of the conversation. And I think that one thing that's true of a lot of working class Americans, Wilk, is that a lot of folks are skeptical of sort of the political establishment in general. And I think many working folks were also very skeptical about sort of the public health establishments and the government's response to COVID-19. Did you share any of that skepticism?
Oh, absolutely. I've been outspoken about it since the very beginning. I've been talking about it on my podcast and other special recordings and different things for probably I think the first time I ever recorded anything being outspoken against the government's response to the pandemic was probably May of 2020. I mean, it was very early on, and yeah, I share that skepticism wholeheartedly, John. It's been one of those things I look at, and I may not look at it the way that some do with the kind of animosity, thinking that other people had some kind of ulterior motive. But
Yeah.
I definitely think that the government's response to this pandemic has probably been one of the largest and um, most brutal mistakes that our government has ever made, and most heinous intrusions upon individual liberty that's ever happened in the history of our country.
And yet, in spite of that intense feeling, you were willing to talk to and communicate with, and I think kind of establish a bit of a friendship at this point with Dr. Francis Collins, who, I mean, really, let's face it, Dr. Collins is one of the leading figures in the public health establishment, and we're about to see a clip of the two of you in dialogue as part of one of our Braver Angels debates. But what is it meant for you to be able to sort of have a rapport with Dr. Collins? Do you consider him to be sort of, you know, a fair dealer on this question? I mean, how has it impacted you to be able to sort of have a bit of a interaction with somebody who obviously was in a position of responsibility for public health at the highest level?
Well, quite honestly, John, I think of Dr. Francis Collins now as a dear friend. Him and I have had
Mm.
several conversations since the beginning of this project. Something, I mean, a complete honor for somebody like me to be able to get involved in a project so closely with somebody like Dr. Francis Collins, somebody who led the NIH. Um, he's obviously got an incredible history, and the things that he's done for the medical community, health, and just humankind all together has
Yeah.
been absolutely incredible. And yeah, do I consider him a fair dealer? Absolutely. We disagree vehemently upon some of the things that have happened since the onset of this pandemic. But coming at this from completely different sides of the topic and being able to enter into that conversation in completely different backgrounds, but to develop a friendship, and it's been absolutely incredible. And we still don't agree on most things with regard to the government's response to the pandemic, but there are some things that we found common ground on. But most importantly, we found the common humanity between the two of us, and how we interact and how we have those discussions.
Well, it's going to defy people's expectations to imagine that people starting from as far apart the chasm of disagreement as you two are when it comes to these sorts of issues can find their way to this deeper level of human trust and even common ground on some of the issues that really matter. But then again, defying those sorts of expectations is what we do at Braver Angels. So without further ado, let's roll the clip.
The personal story about my own experience dates back to November of 2020. That was, of course, in the throes of the worst of COVID-19, where we were desperately needing interventions, therapeutics, and especially vaccines. Many of us working 100-hour weeks were doing everything possible to accelerate the process of developing and then rigorously testing the vaccines that might save lives. And there was a certain evening where the results of a very large-scale trial of the vaccines were going to be revealed because they had been blinded up until that point. I didn't dare to really hope that the results would be all that good because most vaccines fail. But when the results were unveiled, the efficacy of this vaccine turned out to be 95%, well in excess of anything that any of us had dared to hope for. And the safety record was remarkably good. And I will tell you quite honestly, I cried that night, and I also gave thanks because this was an answer to prayer. And I thought there in November of 2020, we're going to lick this virus. We're going to be able to send it packing. And this, I think, will be seen as one of the great science triumphs of our generation because this happened in just 11 months. But then what happened? People did get vaccinated, but a lot of other people didn't.
I look first at everything through the lens of liberty. And because of that, because of liberty and people's desire for liberty, we created here in the United States the best country that has produced more freedom, more opportunity, more greatness for more people than any other country on this planet in the history of mankind. And that can only be done with a government that trusts the people and the people trusting the government. Okay. So with that said, a lot of people have said at times I may be an anti-government person. I'm not anti-government. I'm anti-big, over-intrusive government. And that's what we saw during this pandemic. During this pandemic, we saw the government lay down a heavy hand on the people of this country in a way that they've never done at any other time in our history.
Let's go ahead and move to questions. I see Dr. Collins. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question to me.
Madam Chair, the speaker, my friend Woke, has made a very good point about the way in which public health recommendations have sometimes been applied in ways that did great economic harm to individuals. Does the speaker think that was primarily because the public health system was misguided, or that the politicians took their recommendations and applied them in an irrational way?
All right. Go ahead, Wilk.
I do believe that the government and the politicians and the media in large part played a huge part in misapplying, I can't remember the word the former speaker used, but used that advice and counsel and used it in a lot of times. I believe they used it in a nefarious way, very much so on the media's part and certain politicians. Absolutely.
I do think a lot of what we have been wrestling with when it comes to public health is this balance, as was brought out in the questionnaire, between individual rights and community needs. And this also comes down to this question of what is freedom? Is it all about rights, or is it also about responsibility? And what a public health system has to do is to try to figure out how to balance that, oftentimes in the face of very uncertain parameters where the data is incomplete. You almost have to figure out what's the value of a human life. If you thought that by imposing something that is going to cause a lot of people unhappiness, you could save a few hundred lives, wouldn't you feel like you had to do it anyway? But of course, you should ask the community whether they agree with you on that and not just decide that you know. That's where the tension comes in. And I don't know if that's completely been captured in a lot of the debates about the way in which public health decisions have been made. Even lockdowns. Remember, Donald Trump supported a lockdown because it was thought to be, in spring of 2020, the only way that we were going to save potentially tens of thousands of lives. Turned out not to be very effective. We know that now, but we didn't know that then.
I mean, they actually threw out their own science from the window. I mean, we have so many times Anthony Fauci saying statements like previous infection, giving natural immunity. That has always been a known thing. But suddenly with this one virus, it suddenly wasn't a thing. You know, this one time, like, how is that his entire career as somebody who is pushing, you know, how old is he now? 85 years old. How could somebody have their entire career talking about previous infection, allowing for natural immunity, and then suddenly this time it doesn't? Or saying previously that masks were not as effective, cloth masks, unless you're wearing an N95 or a KN95, that they weren't as effective as, you know, and then suddenly, no, it's the end all be all, and you must, or else we must be masking children when they go to preschool. You know, they didn't even follow their own science. They actually disregarded their own science. And that was something that I think turned the alarm bells on for many of us that said something else is going on here. How could you possibly contradict everything you've said for the last 35 years? And suddenly this time it's not the same. And so
it's the something else part that I'm curious to hear about. I mean, look, I would not put myself forward as somebody in a position to speak authoritatively on the science. We'll get folks in the comments though who will eagerly weigh in, right, on the claims that you just made. But I guess my question here is are you asserting that there's like an incentive problem here too that's similar to some of the other things we've talked? So that's the part I want to get to, because I you know, hypothetically speaking, Fauci could be right or wrong on, you know, some of the particular matters of the science and so forth. But if there are corrupt relationships or just, you know, problematic relationships here that are affecting any of our institutions, and particularly our public health establishments' ability to, in a disinterested way, pursue the well-being of the American people because their interests are going in other directions, then that's something that, we should be able to talk about and recognize. And of course, it has to do with the science, but it's also just a topic unto itself for us to wrap our hands around. Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, when you look at it, the response here in the United States, for example, just going to that natural immunity discussion and how that was so anti-science here in the United States only. That's the other thing. This is not something that they were not doing that in Europe. In Europe, if you had previous COVID infection, you had your COVID passport. Here in the United States, they just said, no, that doesn't count here. You have to get the shot no matter what. Well, here we are. We have politicians. We have Anthony Fauci's research. We have much of the research at Johns Hopkins, much of the research at all of these well-known scientific institutions that are funded by outside interests like Bill Gates. So you have Bill and Melinda Gates. Their foundation has a disproportionate level of influence in our medical system because they fund so much of the scientific research. And vaccines are a particular pet project for Bill Gates in particular. He's been hot on vaccines for a very long time. So when you've got your major funder saying, I really like vaccines and we're going to be really pushing for vaccines and we're putting all of our eggs in the vaccine basket, and people are just catching COVID anyway. And then those people are saying, well, now I got natural immunity according to everybody else in Europe, by the way. And then here in the United States, they say, nope, doesn't count. You still have to get the vaccine. That shows that's a glaringly obvious showcasing of the fact that the money has infiltrated our system to a point where they threw science out the window. And they just said to us, you do what we say or else. And there's no other way around it. No one else in Europe did that. Why is that? Is the science so wrong? I mean, how is it that everyone else in the world recognized natural immunity except for the United States and Canada of all, and maybe Australia too, just Western areas? I mean, does that make scientific sense? Are the scientists that bad in Germany?
Right.
So that what is it with that?
Here's the question.
Yeah.
Because I think that, it would be, by the way, you are going to be invited back. Let me just guarantee you here. Because and the reason I say that is just because I think a lot of what's missing are conversations, and at Braver Angels we exist to sort of try and facilitate this, that allow for us to take all of the various sorts of claims that we have about what things that people are saying that are wrong or possibly even ill motivated, whether it's on the basis of sort of political interest or tribalism or what have you, and show people in the back and forth like how these conversations sort of bring the points together in a way to where we can actually see what's true because we're comparing perspectives rather than just having all the conversations in a vacuum. So one thing, for instance, that we've done is we've had Dr. Francis Collins engage in some programming with us where he's talking to skeptics, people who are within Braver Angels community who do not trust the public health establishment, right? And who have questions that they don't hear being answered, right, by people in positions of authority. And so we're trying to sort of open up some space, right, for people who are good faith skeptics and people who, we certainly hope are good faith, sort of authorities within the establishment, although you might be skeptical, right, about that.
Right.
Nevertheless, trying to open up dialogues that lead to transparency. And so I want to ask you in that spirit, you didn't get the opportunity to speak directly to Dr. Fauci. And I felt like, whether I agree or disagree or fall somewhere in the middle in terms of some of your critiques, that would have been a very useful conversation because you had established yourself with credibility, right, with your followers, and you got a very large audience. And it's not just on the left; it's folks on the right too. You're actually kind of a bipartisan voice, right, in your populism. It would have been an opportunity for somebody who people listen to channel their skepticism directly towards Anthony Fauci in a way that would have given him an opportunity, if he's got the answers to the questions, to sort of like help assuage people's doubts a little bit. And unfortunately, we didn't get that opportunity. I mentioned sort of before, like, this concern over the idea of sort of silencing dissent or not allowing people to sort of scrutinize folks in positions of power. Is that one of the major failings here? Not just that things happen that you might disagree with, but that people like you perhaps, didn't quite get the opportunity to level the criticisms because maybe there was a desire to limit the opportunity for scrutinizing the
Oh, yeah.
policies and people in power.
Yeah, I mean, people were deplatformed, censored. I mean, my first videos when the pandemic first hit and I was doing segments on lab leak theories, I did a segment on myocarditis. They were removed and they were censored. Now we can talk about those things. And now major outlets talk about those things. But when I first put them out there, they were literally removed and it was labeled misinformation. And now it is, the myocarditis, for example, is actually a warning on the actual vaccines. But that was misinformation when I reported on it. So we definitely, that is, I think, the biggest failing of the pandemic was the silencing of any sort of dissent. Anybody who went against was demonized, called conspiracy theorists, whack jobs. If they were saying, hey, ivermectin showed to have some promise from an Australian study, that was early on. They were called, oh, you're believing in horse medicine, horse dewormer. There was just...
We remember the conversation between Joe Rogan and Sanjay Gupta following some of the CNN coverage where they said Joe Rogan was taking...
They said he took horse dewormer. He did not take horse dewormer. He took a medication for human beings. It wasn't for horses. Yes, ivermectin's also given to horses in a horse form. He took a for people form. And yet CNN smeared him and said that he had taken horse dewormer.
Now, many scientists, many public health officials and folks with a great deal more expertise than I have certainly, will cast a lot of doubt over the actual sort of evidentiary basis for the effectiveness of ivermectin. But what was cool about the Rogan CNN sort of controversy was that was followed by a very rare conversation that he had with Sanjay Gupta, where they were able to sort of go back and forth, But that just doesn't happen very often. And
and Sanjay got completely, raked over the coals for appearing on Joe Rogan.
Right.
And then he went back on CNN and continued to basically go back to what he was saying before about Joe Rogan.
And maybe that, that gets back to sort of the institutional pressures and so forth that folks in certain environments operate under. And I know that, I and certainly you have a lot to say about that. But I do want to sort of bring this conversation to an endpoint here, maybe on a note of hope that type of thing, those types of real conversations are still possible.
Yeah.
Right? And it's hard to make it happen perhaps on the highest level. But the amazing thing about what you've done and what we're seeking to do here at Braver Angels is that, through, I think, our own independent ability to sort of create networks and platforms and so forth to sort of raise the voices of the American people, raise our own voices, right? We actually don't necessarily have to wait for the institutions and the establishment and so forth to give us permission to have the conversations we need to have. And hopefully, that can create a culture of interaction, that allows us to challenge each other, not from the vantage point of wanting to destroy each other politically, but to actually just get to what the truth is, right? So we can hold each other accountable for the sake of the American people and to be able to solve, real problems. So I guess my last sort of question to you here is, if we were to do that, would there be greater hope for a society in which we could actually trust our institutions again? If people in positions of power were to not be so afraid of perhaps some of the criticism that they would get or some of the hard questions that they would get, to be able to engage people, would that make it easier for us to move in a direction of depolarizing America and getting back to the point where people trust their institutions again?
I mean, we definitely need to have conversation with one another and to learn from one another. I would say more than holding each other accountable, I would say learning from one another and listening to each other. And we don't have that opportunity as much because, unfortunately, the mechanisms for getting our voices out there are controlled by the big tech companies that decide on their, quote unquote, community guidelines. And so we are unfortunately beholden to that. And we do have to tiptoe around their rules. There's no way around that. So, but I do think that there is, when all of this happened and there was a lot of censorship going on and there was a lot of shutting down, like YouTube, for example, shutting down videos like mine and so many people and deplatforming so many people who had questions about not just the pandemic, but a variety of different subjects. Other companies cropped up like Rumble, right? So now Rumble is growing really fast because it's a platform that is not silencing those conversations. They're not silencing the questioning, the debate, the conversation, what people are thinking. If they're not going with the establishment line, they're not shutting down that conversation. So we're seeing rapid growth of that platform, for example, and many other platforms like it. And we're also seeing the establishment, those organizations shifting. We're seeing CNN, believe it or not. I mean, I can't believe it. Sometimes I turn on CNN lately and I'm surprised they're actually pushing back. They're asking questions. They're pushing back on the, I watched one of the anchors question Rochelle Walensky, and she was actually pressing her and pushing back. And that was something that wasn't happening before. Well, that change happened because CNN saw that it failed with CNN Plus. People are not trusting of CNN anymore. They don't believe in it as a true media organization. They're needing to regain the trust. And the way they're doing it is they are saying, we need to be less in one direction. We need to actually open up conversation and actually push back. Then it's scary to me that reporters are so malleable that they could just take barking orders from somebody at the top and then they behave the way they're supposed to, whether they're supposed to lean one way or be more or push back the next day or something. And look, we also saw my time at the Hill for an entire year where a corporate media company allowed me to push back every single day. They allowed me to push back.
It's true. And a lot of people were struck by that because I think that people weren't used to seeing that, yes, in a reputable sort of corporate, owned media platform, a voice like yours, populist, radical, according to some folks, but sharp and pointed, really asking questions with the directness that people weren't used to hearing in a platform like that.
And I was laughed at by my co-anchors. I was often laughed at. I was ridiculed. They tried, there were times when they would go to management and talk about me and say, we got to get rid of this conspiracy theorist. She's bad for the brand. And ultimately, at the end, 1 year in, they all shifted and they were all saying the same things I was saying. Because I wasn't the one who was wrong all along. I mean, that is just the reality of it, as I was actually following the science. I was following the data and I was reporting on it like a person should if you're in the news business. Right. And sadly, that was met with laughter and ridicule by a lot of others in the news business who ultimately are now the ones being sort of laughed at and ridiculed for being so wrong and just being willing to spout the establishment line or what they're told without really truly looking into it, doing their job as a reporter, as an investigator, as a news person, truly digging into that data. But we are seeing that, at least for that year, now things changed, ownership and management changed. I think that's had a lot to do with why I was prohibited from interviewing Fauci. I think they moved more in establishment direction, unfortunately. But there was a window where, and to be honest with you, part of it was because there was no management for that year. There, it was like
I see you got in with the babysitter.
I got it right. Yeah, there was. It was. Yeah, it was really. It was in flux. The old owner had sold it. A new owner had come in, but the new owner hadn't really quite taken over yet. They didn't really know what to do with it quite yet. So there was a period of transition, and I was in that corporate media space during a period of transition, and I basically got to take advantage of that transition when the adults weren't in the room.
Gotcha.
And so I got to say whatever I wanted to say.
I met you in a debate with my friend Nick Hancock, who's a leader of the Republican Liberty Caucus in Los Angeles. And the very first thing I learned about you was that this is somebody who's not afraid to give her opinion, but she's also not afraid to defend it, and that she's somebody who's willing to do so in a way that, really is fiercely defensive of the truth as she sees it, but without trying to make it personal,
And Nick is great too, by the way. That was when we did meet, and Nick and I debated each other at that. On I think it was an abortion debate, right? It was a women's,
It was. That's right.
And he was on one side, and I was on the other of that. And what's interesting is that Nick, he's reached out to me several times since then, and we've chatted a few times, and he's also one of those people that bridges the divide. That when he agrees with you, he's willing to say, I agree with you on this and you're doing a great job. Right. And he's reached out to me over the last couple of years during the pandemic to say, you're doing awesome. Really glad to see you, getting out there and telling, and representing a different side that wasn't being represented at all in media. And so, there is this, there are people coming together from both sides that are truly wanting to have the conversation and in agreement and wanting to see more, just more of the ideas out there. And a lot of people tell me, I don't agree with you, but I like hearing what you have to say.
Right.
And we should be able to have more of that.
That's right. Some people are always looking for an endpoint to conversations in our politics. But honestly, in democracy, the debate always continues. And the question is as the conversation evolves, are we evolving too? So I hope we can continue the conversation with you, Kim Iversen.
Thank you for having me. This has been fun.
Thank you for joining me. Thank you for listening to Uniting America. If you'd like to support the show, you can do it by subscribing on YouTube and on your favorite podcast platform and leaving us a positive rating, review, or suggestions. Follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and tune in for more content. And learn more about the movement to depolarize America at braverangels.org.